Blake Shelton is not the man the cameras invented. The world knows the version they were given. The towering Oklahoma giant, with the crooked grin and the unshakable confidence. The man who sat at the center of the most watched singing competition in television history for over a decade. The country superstar whose voice filled arenas from Nashville to Los Angeles without ever seeming to break a sweat. 30 #1 singles, 9 Grammy nominations, a television career that made him a household name in homes that had never once tuned in to country radio. An empire built not in boardrooms, but in the red dirt of Oklahoma. One handshake, one chorus, one honest word at a time. That version of Blake Shelton is real, but it is not complete. Have you ever looked at someone who seems to have everything? The fame, the money, to the love, and wondered what they are actually carrying when the cameras go off? Because behind the easy laugh and the stadium-sized charisma, a different story has been unfolding. Quietly, painfully, and in ways the cameras were never entirely invited to witness. A story not of triumph alone, but of a body pushed to its breaking point, of a man who used food and alcohol as armor against grief he never fully learned to carry, of a face in the mirror that stopped looking familiar, of nights in Oklahoma, silence when the weight of loss, a brother gone too soon, a father taken by time, a marriage shattered under the spotlight, settled onto his shoulders like a debt no amount of success could erase. This is the story of what fame costs, not in dollars or applause, but in the quiet, relentless currency of health, peace, and the kind of honesty that only arrives after everything else has been tried. By 2023, fans began to notice something was wrong. The man who had always been built like he was, made for the outdoors, tall, broad, seemingly indestructible, was looking different. His face was fuller. His energy, once the loudest thing in any room, seemed muted. Photographs circulated on social media with the kind of cruelty the internet reserves for anyone who dares to age or struggle in public. The whispers grew louder. Was Blake Shelton sick? Was something happening behind those gates in Tishomingo that nobody was talking about? The answer, as it so often is, was not a single dramatic event, but a lifetime of accumulated choices, of grief swallowed rather than spoken, of habits formed in heartbreak and never fully released, of a body that finally began to refuse the terms it had been living under for decades. And here is the question nobody was asking out loud. How does a man that strong end up that broken? And what does it actually take to come back? What followed was a transformation. Not the kind sold in advertisements or announced with fanfare, but the slow, unglamorous, deeply human kind. The kind that requires a man to look honestly at himself and admit that the version of strength he had been performing was not the same as the real thing. This is that story. From the silence of Ada, Oklahoma, where a 14-year-old boy first learned what it meant to lose everything he thought was permanent, to the ranch in Tishomingo, where a man in his 40s finally began the long, difficult work of healing. From the darkest nights of the Miranda Lambert divorce, when alcohol became both companion and catastrophe, to the mornings beside Gwen Stefani when he chose, for the first time, to fight for the life still in front of him. Stay with us until the end, because the moment that finally forced Blake Shelton to change everything is not the one you are expecting. And when we get there, you will understand why it shook him to his core. Before we begin, if Blake Shelton's music has ever found you at the right moment, in the right silence, leave a like. Because behind every one of those songs was a man paying a price you never saw. And that price deserves to be told. If you want more stories like this one, the real ones, the ones that go behind the legend, hit subscribe. Every week, we bring you the truth behind the names the world thinks it already knows. To understand what Blake Shelton became, you first have to understand where he began. And where he began was about as far from a Hollywood spotlight as a person can get. Ada, Oklahoma. Population just over 17,000. A small city in the southern part of the state where the land is flat and wide and the sky seems to go on forever in every direction. A place where people know their neighbors, where Friday nights belong to high school football, where the values passed down at the dinner table are not complicated. Work hard, love your family, be honest, and never forget where you came from. It is not a place that produces many global superstars, but it produced one. Blake Tollison Shelton was born on June 18, 1976, to Dorothy Ann Shelton, a beauty salon owner who ran her shop with quiet determination. He and Richard Lee Shelton, known to everyone simply as Dick, a used car salesman whose hands were always busy and whose word was his bond. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. But they were the kind of family that showed up, that stayed, and that built its life around the people inside it rather than the world outside. Blake was the youngest of 3 children, and from the beginning, the one who seemed to carry music in his bones without anyone having to put it there. By age 12, his uncle had taught him to play guitar. By 15, he had written his first original song. By 16, he had already won the Denbo Diamond Award, the most prestigious honor in Oklahoma's youth music scene. A recognition that something unusual was growing inside that ordinary small-town life. But the music, as much as it defined him, was not the most important thing happening in the Shelton household during those years. That distinction belonged to his older brother, Richie. Before we go any further, think about the person in your life who made you who you are. The one whose voice you still hear when you are making a decision that matters. For Blake Shelton, that person was Richie. And what happened to Richie changed everything. Richie Shelton was 10 years older than Blake, a half-brother through their shared mother Dorothy, whose first husband was a man named Ronnie Musgrove. When Dorothy married Dick Shelton, Dick took Richie in without hesitation, raised him as his own son, and never made the boy feel like anything less. Blake would remember that act of quiet grace for the rest of his life. His father choosing love over biology, choosing presence over distance. And it was a lesson that would come back to him decades later in ways he could not yet imagine. To the 14-year-old Blake, Richie was not simply a brother. He was the coolest person in the world. Richie's bedroom was right across the hallway, and from that room came a constant soundtrack. Hank Williams Jr., Waylon Jennings, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Bob Seger, whatever was moving through the radio at any given moment. Richie loved all of it, with an openness that was infectious. He introduced Blake to the architecture of American music without ever intending to teach a lesson. Just by being himself, just by loving what he loved loudly enough for his little brother to hear through a thin wall. Blake absorbed every note, every album, every conversation about songs and what they meant. He wanted to be Richie, and not in the way that children sometimes admire and move on, but in the deep, permanent way that shapes a person's identity before they are old enough to understand that is what is happening. Then, on November 13, 1990, the world went silent. Richie Shelton, 24 years old, was riding as a passenger in a car driven by his girlfriend on a rural road outside Ada. The sun was low and blinding that morning. His girlfriend crested a hill and did not see the school bus stopped ahead. picking up children for the day. The collision was catastrophic. Richie was killed. His girlfriend was killed. Her 3-year-old son was killed. 3 lives erased in a single moment of terrible, ordinary accident. The kind that happens on roads like that one every day, and that no one sees coming, and that no one is ever ready for. Blake was 14 years old. He later described what followed as the world going silent. A silence so complete and so sudden that it felt like a physical thing, like something had been removed from the air itself. For weeks afterward, he would reach for the phone to call Richie, to tell him something funny he had seen on television, to share something that had happened at school. And then the realization would crash back in, again and again, that there was no one to call, that the bedroom across the hallway was empty, that the record player would not be playing anymore. His father, Dick, sat him down during those impossible early days and told him something that Blake would carry for the rest of his life. Look, you will never, ever get over this. You are just going to have to learn to get used to it. It was not a gentle comfort, and it was an honest one, and in its honesty it was perhaps the most useful thing anyone said to Blake Shelton in the entire year that followed. He held on to those words. He let them teach him what grief actually was. Not something to be solved or resolved or moved past, but something to be absorbed slowly, integrated into the fabric of a life until it became part of the weave rather than a hole in it. But there is a cost to absorbing grief that way, a cost that does not announce itself immediately. It accumulates quietly, invisibly, in the choices a person makes when the pain surfaces and there is no language ready for it. In the drink reached for, in the silence chosen over conversation, in the endless forward motion of ambition that can feel like healing and is sometimes just avoidance. Blake left Ada at 17. I'm barely out of high school and moved to Nashville to chase the only thing that had ever made the silence bearable. Music. Richie's music. The records from across the hallway, now living inside him, demanding to come out. He carried Ada with him. He carried Richie with him. He carried the silence with him too. That particular Oklahoma silence that settles over you after loss, and that no amount of noise, no stage, no applause can entirely drown out. What would you have done at 17? Stayed in the safety of home, or packed everything and chased the one thing that felt like your brother's voice? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. It would take Blake Shelton more than 20 years to understand that the silence had followed him all the way to the top, and that until he turned around and faced it, it was going to keep costing him more than he could afford to pay. Nashville in 1994 was not waiting for Blake Shelton. It never waits for anyone. The city has a way of receiving young dreamers with open arms and then quietly, systematically, testing every single thing they think they know about themselves. Blake arrived at 17. 2 weeks after graduating high school in Ada, barely old enough to rent an apartment, carrying nothing but a guitar, an Oklahoma accent, and the kind of stubbornness that either gets you somewhere or gets you nowhere, and rarely anything in between. The first years were not glamorous. They were not even close. He worked odd jobs around the city, painting houses, doing whatever it took to keep the lights on, while spending every available hour chasing the connections and the contracts that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Nashville's music publishing houses were his classroom and his rejection factory simultaneously. Doors that opened just enough to let him believe they might stay open, then swung quietly shut again. He learned the rules of the city the hard way, which is the only way Nashville actually teaches them. His first major break came not from talent alone, though the talent was undeniable, but from a chance encounter with Mae Boren Axton, a legendary songwriter who told the teenager from Oklahoma that he had something worth bringing to Music City. That conversation lit a fire under him. Then, in 1998, producer Bobby Braddock, the man behind some of the greatest songs in country music history, discovered a tall, funny, a mullet-headed kid with an irreverent spirit and a voice that sounded like it had been aged in an Oklahoma barn. Braddock brought him to Giant Records. A deal was signed. The machine began to turn. But even then, nothing came easy. The label selected his debut single, a song called Austin, a tune Blake himself initially resisted, thinking it too sentimental, too soft for the image he thought a countryman was supposed to project. His producer convinced him to listen again. He did. He changed his mind. Giant released Austin in April of 2001. 2 weeks later, the label shut its doors entirely. Blake Shelton's career had officially begun and nearly ended before a single radio station had played the second verse. Warner Brothers Nashville stepped in, rescued the contract, kept the single in circulation, and watched it climb. By August of 2001, Austin sat at #1 on the Billboard Hot Country Singles chart, where it stayed for 5 consecutive weeks, tying a record set by Billy Ray Cyrus nearly a decade earlier. The kid from Ada, Oklahoma, who had spent 7 years painting houses and knocking on doors, had arrived. But here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. What does a man from a small town do when the world suddenly gets very, very big, very, very fast? How do you stay grounded when everything around you is designed to pull you into the current? For Blake, the answer came naturally, almost dangerously so. Because in Nashville, in country music, in the culture that surrounded him during those years of rapid ascent, the answer to almost every question was the same. You celebrate, you drink, you perform, you drink some more, and you call it living. To be fair, this was not simply a personal flaw. It was an entire cultural ecosystem. Country music has always had an honest, complicated, occasionally destructive relationship with alcohol. It is woven into the music itself. The honky-tonks, the cold beers on tailgates, the whiskey that makes heartbreak speakable and success feel real. Blake did not invent that culture. He was born into it, musically and personally, and he embraced it with the same full-throttle commitment he brought to everything else in his life. By his own admission, he was proud of it. "My heart and soul is being a redneck," he said in 2011, "and drinking, and being stupid." He wore his reputation as a drinker, the way he wore his Oklahoma roots. As a badge of identity, a signal of authenticity, a proof that he was exactly who he said he was, and not performing someone else's idea of a country star. His Twitter handle featured the word drunk as a descriptor. He joked about vodka in Starbucks cups during morning interviews. He fell off a stage at a concert in Oregon in 2018, tweeted about it the next day with his own commentary about how much he had been drinking, and turned the whole episode into a moment of self-deprecating humor that his fans loved. And then came The Voice. When NBC launched the singing competition in 2011, Blake Shelton was already a star. But The Voice transformed him into something else entirely. A cultural institution. Week after week, season after season, the man from Ada sat in that iconic red chair and became one of the most recognized faces in American television. His wit was disarming. His coaching was genuine. His on-screen rivalry with Adam Levine became the kind of television chemistry that producers dream about and cannot manufacture. Audiences who had never owned a country album knew Blake Shelton's name, his laugh, his personality. He stayed on The Voice for 23 seasons. 9 of his teams won. The money was extraordinary. Reports at the time estimated his salary reached $13 million per season. By the mid-2010s, Forbes placed his annual income at $28.5 million. The boy who had painted houses in Nashville to survive was now one of the highest-paid figures in American entertainment. And through all of it, the tours, the recording sessions, the endless television commitments, he was drinking, consistently, publicly, proudly. The first marriage, to Kynette Grin in 2003, ended in divorce in 2006 before the Voice era began. And both parties maintained a quiet dignity about it that protected what privacy remained. But the second marriage, the one that would reshape him more profoundly than anything else in his professional life, was a different story entirely. Miranda Lambert, fellow country star, fellow Oklahoma soul, a woman whose talent matched his and whose fire, creative, emotional, relentless, burned at the same furious temperature. They had dated for 5 years before marrying in 2011, a union that felt, to the country music world, like a kind of inevitability. Two of the biggest names in the genre, building a life together in the dirt and the noise of Nashville. It seemed like the kind of story that was supposed to last. It did not. On July 20th, 2015, they announced their divorce in a joint statement that was measured, dignified, and devastating. "This is not the future we envisioned," they said, "and it is with heavy hearts that we move forward separately." The country music world went quiet for a beat. Then the tabloids detonated. The stories that followed were merciless. Claims about drinking, claims about infidelity, claims about rock bottoms. Blake denied the most extreme allegations fiercely, eventually suing a tabloid for defamation over a cover story that portrayed him as a man in free fall. But in quieter, more honest moments, away from the legal briefs and the press releases, he admitted what he could not entirely deny. 2 days after the divorce announcement, he sat for a television interview sipping vodka from a solo cup. When asked what he was drinking, he smiled and said he thought he would go ahead and get it started early. The joke landed. But underneath it was something that did not entirely feel like a joke. He later described the months following the split as hitting rock bottom. His words, not a tabloid's invention. He said that the devastation of a failed marriage at that level of public scrutiny was unlike anything he had been equipped to handle. That the silence of the ranch in Tishomingo, once a sanctuary, had become something closer to an echo chamber for every regret he could not outrun. "So when I was going through my divorce," he said in an NBC interview, "and just hit rock bottom like anybody does when they go through something that devastating, it's a miracle that I met somebody who was going through the same exact thing." That somebody was Gwen Stefani. And her arrival in his life, which we will come to, would be the beginning of the first real reckoning Blake Shelton ever had with the version of himself he had been building for 20 years. The one who drank to celebrate, drank to forget. Drank because the culture said it was fine, and the persona said it was him. And who had never fully stopped to ask whether any of it was actually doing him any good. So let me ask you this. Have you ever used something, food, work, humor, anything, as a way to avoid dealing with a pain you were not ready to face? If Blake Shelton's story is resonating with you right now, drop a comment below. You might be surprised how many people are in the same place. The reckoning was coming. It would not arrive quietly. There is a moment that Blake Shelton has described more than once in more than one interview that cuts through all the noise of celebrity and gets to something genuinely human. It happened on the set of The Voice in 2015, on the day he had to tell the cast and crew that his marriage to Miranda Lambert was over. He looked across the room, and there was Gwen Stefani, a woman he barely knew at the time, with tears in her eyes. Not polite sympathy, real tears. The kind that come from recognition rather than pity. He did not know it yet, but she was living the same devastation, privately, at exactly the same moment. Gwen Stefani's marriage to Gavin Rossdale, the British rock musician, had also collapsed in 2015 after 13 years and 3 sons, Kingston, Zuma, and Apollo. She had built her life around that family. When it fell apart, she later told The Guardian, "It felt like a catastrophe, not a setback. A catastrophe. The kind of destruction that makes you question whether you know how to rebuild, or whether the person you thought you were still exists underneath the rubble. 2 people, shattered by the same kind of loss, at the same time, in the same building, 5 days a week. What began as weekly check-in emails between 2 colleagues trying to process unimaginable public heartbreak became something neither of them had planned or particularly wanted. Frequent texts, late-night conversations, the slow, tentative construction of a friendship that refused to stay a friendship. Next thing I know, I wake up, and she's all I care about, Blake told Billboard in 2016. So Gwen saved my life. Who else on earth could understand going through a high-profile divorce from another musician? You can't even imagine the similarities in our divorces. Gwen, for her part, almost walked away from it entirely. The chaos of both their lives was too much, she said. At one point, she cut off contact. It was Blake who reached out again, with the opening lines of a song he had started writing, asking if she would finish the verse. She wrote him back. That was the moment neither of them could walk back from. They went public in late 2015. They got engaged in October of 2020. On July 3, 2021, inside a chapel that Blake had built specifically for her on his ranch in Tishomingo, Oklahoma, with Carson Daly officiating and only family surrounding them, and Blake Shelton and Gwen Stefani were married. And here is what nobody talks about enough when they tell this love story. What Gwen actually walked into. Because falling in love with Blake Shelton in 2015 was not just falling in love with a man. It was walking into a lifestyle and a set of habits that would take years to begin reshaping. The ranch life suited Blake the way water suits a fish. Oklahoma was where he breathed, where he hunted and fished and planted corn and drove back roads at dusk, doing, as he once said, exactly the things he sang about. For a California-raised pop star who had spent her adult life in recording studios and tour buses between Los Angeles and London, the adjustment was real. But Gwen made it. She planted gardens. She got her own tractor. She learned to love the wide silence of the Oklahoma land. Blake, meanwhile, was doing something else entirely. He was settling into comfort. The specific, slow, dangerous comfort of a man who has everything he thought he wanted and no longer has the structure of a television production schedule forcing him to function at a particular standard every single day. In 2023, after 23 seasons, Blake Shelton left The Voice. It was a deliberate choice. He wanted to be present for Gwen's boys, to slow down, to be the kind of stepfather and husband that a life built entirely around work had never allowed him to be. Those intentions were real, and they were admirable. But intention and execution are not the same thing. And without the relentless rhythm of production weeks, without the cameras and the competition and the accountability of showing up to a live television broadcast in front of millions, something else began to fill the space. Food Inertia, the comfort of the ranch without the discipline that had once counterbalanced it. Sources close to the couple began speaking publicly about the concern by late 2023 and into 2024. Reports described his weight as having increased by more than 30 pounds in roughly 8 months, with insiders noting the pattern of losing weight and then returning to old habits. The descriptions were not flattering. Barbecue pork sandwiches, soda, beer, the same indulgences that had always been part of his identity, now without the counterweight of a demanding professional schedule to burn any of it off. His wife reportedly grew increasingly worried, with those close to the couple saying everyone agreed something needed to change for the sake of his health. Gwen, whose own relationship with fitness and wellness was meticulous and long established, was watching the man she loved make choices that frightened her. Not out of vanity, but out of genuine concern for what those choices were building toward. Hypertension, diabetes risk, the creeping, invisible damage that excess weight and alcohol impose on a body over time. Damage that does not announce itself until it is already substantial. And the alcohol was still there. In a 2023 interview that landed with quiet force, Blake spoke with uncommon honesty about where things stood. He admitted that cutting back had been harder than he expected, saying his New Year's resolution was to either cut back significantly or stop drinking altogether, and that he had not managed it yet. It was a rare moment of public vulnerability from a man who had always worn his drinking like a flag. Not a collapse, not a crisis, just a quiet, honest admission that the thing he had always joked about had become something more complicated. There is something worth pausing on here, because Blake Shelton's relationship with alcohol was never simply about excess. It was about identity. The redneck from Ada, Oklahoma, who drank because that was what real men from that world did, and who built that image into a brand so successfully that challenging it felt like dismantling a piece of who he was. Letting go of that image was not just a health decision. It was an existential one. A man in his late 40s, sitting on a ranch in Oklahoma, being asked by the life he had built, by the woman who loved him, by the stepsons who watched him, by the body that was increasingly honest about its limits, to become someone slightly different from the person he had always proudly performed. You know what I think is the hardest part of that moment? It is not the changing. It is the admitting that the version of yourself you were most proud of was also the one that was quietly hurting you. Have you ever had to let go of a part of your identity to take care of yourself? Tell me in the comments. Because Blake Shelton was not alone in that struggle, and neither are you. The mirror was not lying anymore. The scale was not lying anymore. And the woman across the breakfast table on the Oklahoma ranch, the one who had chosen the most unexpected life imaginable with the most unlikely man imaginable, was not saying nothing anymore either. Something had to change. Not because the world demanded it, because the life he had finally built, after everything, was worth protecting. The turning point did not arrive with a dramatic announcement. No press release, no televised confession, no headline moment designed for public consumption. It arrived the way most real turning points do. Quietly, privately, in the accumulated weight of small moments that eventually became too heavy to keep carrying. For Blake Shelton, that moment came somewhere in the early weeks of 2024. He stepped on a scale, and the number staring back at him was 250 pounds. He had gained more than 30 pounds in roughly 8 months, a pace that felt, he later admitted, like it had come out of nowhere, even though the choices that produced it had been entirely visible all along. The barbecue, the beer, the inertia of ranch life without structure, and the comfort foods eaten not out of celebration, but out of habit. The alcohol that had always been a personality trait suddenly looking in the unforgiving arithmetic of a scale, like something else entirely. "The scale wouldn't lie," he said, in the candid, slightly self-mocking tone he has always used to talk about the things that embarrass him. And I just thought, man, you've got to do something about this, buddy. It sounds simple, but for Blake Shelton, a man who had spent his entire adult life treating his body as an instrument of performance rather than an object of care, it was anything but. Because the decision to change was not just a dietary one, it was an identity decision. And it was the Oklahoma redneck who drank beer and ate what he wanted, and didn't apologize for it, finally having an honest conversation with the 47-year-old man whose body was quietly keeping score of every year those choices had accumulated. And here is what makes his story genuinely interesting. Because anyone can go on a diet. What Blake Shelton had to do was something harder. He had to change without losing himself. Can you think of a time when you had to make a change that felt like it was threatening who you were? Leave a comment. I'd genuinely like to hear it. The approach he chose was not extreme. It was not a crash diet, not a dramatic fitness overhaul, not the kind of transformation story built on punishment and deprivation. It was something more sustainable, and perhaps because of that, more lasting. See, he cleaned up his diet, cutting processed foods and leaning into lean proteins, vegetables, and whole grains. He started moving again, beginning with walks on the ranch, then building toward more structured activity. He took up boxing, which surprised him. "I always hated the gym," he admitted, "but boxing felt different. It kept me engaged, and I started feeling stronger." He mowed the lawn with the kind of deliberate enthusiasm that only a man who has decided to treat every movement as an investment can bring to lawn care. He also began to recognize the connection between his mental and physical health, understanding that stress, emotional habits, and overall wellness were inseparable from what was happening to his body. The grief he had always processed sideways, through humor, through noise, through the next drink, needed a different channel. He started talking to people, hiking in the Oklahoma landscape that had always been his sanctuary, sitting in the quiet of the ranch, not as a man hiding from the world, but as a man beginning, perhaps for the first time, to actually rest in it. He began pursuing therapy alongside his physical transformation, acknowledging that the body and the mind were not separate problems requiring separate solutions. For a man whose public persona had always been built on self-sufficiency and toughness, the big country boy from Ada who could handle anything, that acknowledgement was not a small one. It was, in its own quiet way, a form of courage that none of his stadium performances had ever required. And then there was the alcohol. And this piece of the transformation was the most honest and the most difficult. In early 2024, Blake publicly stated that his New Year's resolution was to either cut back significantly or stop drinking altogether, and that even cutting back had proven harder than he expected. He did not dress it up. He did not reframe it as a casual lifestyle adjustment. He said it the way it was. This thing that had always been part of his identity, that he had joked about for 20 years, that his brand had been built around in ways both deliberate and accidental. It was harder to walk away from than he had imagined. Not because he lacked willpower, but because it was woven into everything. Into how he socialized, into how he dealt with quiet, into how he had processed every difficult thing since the silence following Richie's death back in November of 1990. The skin told a story too. Friends and observers had begun noting the visible effects of decades of outdoor Oklahoma living. Sun damage accumulating on his face in patterns that dermatologists identified as potentially concerning. The kind of chronic exposure that country life almost invisibly produces, and that most men in that world never think to address until the damage is already done. Blake, who had never been the kind of man to schedule a dermatology appointment, began paying attention. Through all of it, the dietary changes, the exercise, the therapy sessions, the honest accounting of what alcohol had cost him. Gwen Stefani was present, not as a disciplinarian, not as a health coach with a clipboard, but as a partner who had chosen this life with him and wanted him in it for a long time. She encouraged him when the treadmill felt pointless. She cooked alongside him when the ranch habits pulled toward comfort food. She was, as one person close to the couple put it, less worried about how he looked than about how long he would last. That is a different kind of concern, and it lands differently. By early 2025, the results were visible and verified. Blake had lost somewhere between 30 and 40 pounds, bringing his weight down to approximately 210 pounds. The energy that had dulled in the post-Voice years had returned. He was performing again. Residency dates in Las Vegas, new music, and the album For Recreational Use Only, released in May of 2025, that announced itself as the work of a man who had not disappeared, but had simply taken the time to figure out what he actually wanted to say. He was not perfect. He said so himself. The cravings for barbecue did not vanish. The old habits did not dissolve without resistance. But the difference between the man who reached 250 pounds in late 2024 and the man standing on a Las Vegas stage in 2025 was not just a number on a scale. It was the difference between a man running from his health and a man who had finally decided to run toward it instead. "It's not just about your body," he acknowledged, in words that carried more weight than their simplicity suggested. "Not, it's about your mind." The boy from Ada, Oklahoma, who had spent a lifetime performing strength while privately carrying grief, was learning something his father had tried to teach him 34 years ago on the worst night of their lives. That you do not get over the hard things, you just learn to carry them differently. And when you start carrying them honestly, with the help of the right people, in the right place, with your eyes open, the weight of them becomes something you can actually live with. You know what I think is the most underrated part of this story? It is not the 30 or 40 pounds. It is the fact that a man who built his entire brand on not caring finally cared. And he did it without pretending it was easy. From 0 to 10, how much do you respect someone more when they admit the struggle instead of just showing you the result? Drop your number in the comments. There is a ranch in Tishomingo, Oklahoma, that tells a story no interview has ever fully captured. It sits on over 1,000 acres of red dirt and open sky. The kind of land that demands nothing from you except presence. There are lakes where bass move slow and heavy beneath the surface. There are animals that need tending, fields that need working, and mornings that begin before the sun has finished deciding whether to show up. It is not a celebrity retreat. It is not a branded lifestyle. It is a working ranch that a boy from Ada always dreamed of owning, and that a man approaching 50 has finally learned to actually live on. Not just visit between commitments, not just use as a backdrop for social media, but genuinely, quietly inhabit. This is where Blake Shelton is in 2026. See, and the distance between the man who exists on that ranch today and the version of himself the world first met in 2001 is not measured in hit singles or television seasons or pounds lost on a scale. It is measured in something harder to quantify and more important to understand. In the slow, unglamorous, deeply human work of learning who you actually are underneath everything you built to impress everyone else. Here is the question, worth carrying into the final chapter of this story. What does a man who had everything and still felt like something was missing finally find when he stops running long enough to look? The answer, for Blake Shelton, begins and ends in the same place. Family. When he married Gwen Stefani in July of 2021, he did not simply gain a wife. He gained 3 stepsons, Kingston, Zuma, and Apollo. Boys who had grown up between a British rock musician father and a California pop star mother, and who now found themselves spending significant portions of their lives on an Oklahoma ranch with a country singer who taught them how to get their hands in the dirt. Blake has spoken about that role with a reverence that surprised even people who thought they knew him well. "Every day I've fallen in love with the boys as much as I do with Gwen," he said at the country radio seminar in 2022. And those were not the words of a man performing the part of stepfather for an audience. They were the words of a man who had discovered, late and unexpectedly, that the thing he had always been chasing, connection, permanence, to the sense that something he loved would still be there in the morning, had been available all along. It had just required him to stop long enough to receive it. And by December of 2025, that investment showed its return in the most unguarded way imaginable. At the season finale of The Road, the CBS reality competition Blake co-created and executive produced alongside Yellowstone's Taylor Sheridan, Zuma and Apollo showed up at Nashville's Ryman Auditorium in cowboy hats to watch their stepfather perform. The 2 boys sang along and nodded to the beat from their spot in the crowd as Blake took the stage to perform his most recent #1 single. It was not a staged family moment. It was simply a father and his sons in the place where country music was born, sharing something real. Zuma, who has been showing up at Blake's Ole Red venue in Tishomingo, performing country sets with increasing confidence, has become something that clearly moves Blake more than any award ever has. A stepson who discovered country music not because his stepfather pushed it on him, but because he fell in love with it himself. Blake has described the experience with characteristic directness. "It's not me showing him stuff. It's him showing me stuff. Have you heard this artist? Listen to this song. It's almost every single day. I love it. I can't wait till I get home." That sentence, "I can't wait till I get home," that is the one that matters most. It is the sentence that the Blake Shelton of 2015, sitting in an empty ranch after a devastating divorce, drinking alone with a Twitter bio that simply read, "Drunk," I could not have said and meant it the way he means it now. He approaches stepfatherhood the way his own father once approached raising Richie, with deliberate love, with the understanding that a man who shows up consistently, who steps back when stepping back is the right thing, and steps forward when being there is what matters, is performing the most important act of his life without an audience to applaud it. "I try to be careful about when to step in and be smart about when to step back," he has said. "But no matter what, always be there if I'm needed." The professional picture in early 2026 tells a story of a man who found a pace that fits him. His live in Las Vegas residency at the Coliseum at Caesar's Palace, which ran through January of 2026 to sold-out crowds, they proved so popular that he immediately added another 8 dates for May, announcing the extension in the most Blake Shelton way possible by riding a Kubota tractor down the Las Vegas Strip and handing the keys to a valet for check-in. The crowd loved it. More importantly, he loved it. Performing on his own terms, without the relentless production schedule of 23 seasons of network television, without having to be somewhere else the following Monday. With 31 #1 singles, 52 million singles sold, 13 million albums sold, and nearly 11 billion global streams, the statistical case for Blake Shelton's place in country music history is settled. But the number that matters most is the one that arrived in early 2026. His most recent chart topper making him the second most successful artist in the history of the country airplay chart, behind only Kenny Chesney. It is a record that belongs to Ada, Oklahoma, as much as it belongs to him. The Road, which completed its first season in December of 2025, represents something meaningful in the arc of his career. It is not The Voice, not a massive, all-consuming machine that required him to be in Los Angeles for months at a time. It is a show built on the gritty, unfiltered truth of what it actually costs to be a working musician. 12 real artists competing as opening acts for Keith Urban at venues across America, night after night, in front of real crowds who decide their fate. It is, in other words, a show built on Blake Shelton's actual values. Not polish, not spectacle. Truth and effort. The Road. His health remains an ongoing commitment rather than a completed project. And he says so without apology. The weight came down and has held. The exercise has become part of the ranch routine rather than a temporary intervention. The alcohol conversation continues. Honestly, imperfectly, the way real conversations about difficult habits actually go, rather than the way they look in redemption narratives. The sun damage that accumulated from decades of Oklahoma outdoor life remains something requiring active monitoring, a reminder that even the lifestyle he loves most carries costs he once did not think to account for. He pays attention now. That is the difference. Richie's shadow is still present in all of it. It always will be. The boy whose bedroom was across the hallway, whose records became Blake's education, to whose death on a November morning in 1990 carved a silence into Blake's life that no amount of noise has ever fully filled. He is still there. In the way Blake talks about music with Zuma, in the way he reaches for his phone on the 13th of every November and feels, even now, the old reflex to call someone who is not there to answer. In the lines of "over you," still costing him something every time it surfaces, but grief carried. Honestly is different from grief carried in secret. And the Blake Shelton of 2026 is, for perhaps the first time, a man who carries his honestly. The silence that fell on November 13th, 1990, never left. But Blake Shelton has learned at last to fill it with the right things. With Gwen, with Kingston and Zuma and Apollo in cowboy hats at the Ryman. With the tractor, he rode down the Las Vegas Strip because he is still, underneath all of it, exactly the man he always said he was. Just a better, healthier, more honest version of him. The boy from Ada made it. Not to the version of success he imagined at 17. To something harder to build and more worth keeping. And now the question is yours. What did Blake Shelton's story teach you today about health, about grief, about the kind of strength that does not announce itself? Leave your answer in the comments below. The best ones always come from people who have been there themselves. If this story moved you, hit like and subscribe. Every week, we bring you the real story behind the names the world thinks it already knows. The untold chapters. The honest ones. You are exactly where you are supposed to be.